Okay, so good morning to you all, and I'm sorry for this technical complications. I'm very pleased to be here, um, or not to be here, to be here in the Netherlands talking to you. Um, so when Sim invited me to talk to you, he suggested that the my challenge would be to create some sort of more dialogue between people working in heritage studies and people working like myself in memory studies. And indeed, it's been my perception in the last few years that we've had a lot of discussion going on in memory studies and in heritage studies, which is echoing each other, even though we seem to be using this different frameworks and different concepts. In fact, we're talking about very related things, and it's high time that we got into more conversation. And what I mean by the different sort of emphasis we have in both memory studies and heritage studies, we're all talking about a relationship between the past and the present. In memory studies, we're talking more about meanings, narratives, and intangibles. Whereas in heritage studies, as I imagine it, I'm not an expert, the emphasis seems to be more on material objects, built environment, and on the tangible. And I know there's this idea of intangible heritage, but for me, that is already part of the challenge to create a more of a conversation between these different groups. So what I'm going to try to do today is talk from the perspective of memory studies to give you a sense of how I look at the relationship between materiality and memory. And so forgive me if this is going to be very much an introduction to the basics of memory studies, but hopefully it's one which will help us to create more basis for the dialogue I've been talking about. For me, memory studies is basically about two things. It's about storytelling, about how we represent the past, and identity formation. What those stories tell us about who we are as individuals, but also who we are as a collective, and where are we going to. In the 1920s, and particularly his book La Mémoire collective, which only appeared in 1950. So we have these two different strands within memory studies, and they are carried by two different disciplines, but at the same time, we see increasingly an interesting conversation going on between those who emphasize cultural memory and those who emphasize collective memory, because in a sense, we're all dealing with this interplay between stories and identity formation. As I said, my particular point of access to this dynamic is through the idea of mediation, and that is this production of stories. And I'm interested in stories which are told in many different media. And I use the word mediation as a very central concept for me. The ways in which we use not just words, but our images, our objects, but all of these together in order to produce stories about the past. And what makes cultural memory studies, I think, stand out is the fact that we're interested in the movement of stories across all these different media, because this movement across the media often entails a movement across different domains of activity, from the domains of science in history writing, from the legal court, law courts and testimony, to the arts, and then to more public events in the form of monuments, which we'll be talking about more later, and commemorative rituals. So if we look at the interplay between these different forms of mediation, we see the production of different forms of identity. Obviously, personal identity, I call it embodied identity, the identity we have in our hearts and minds as we think about where we came from and where we're going to. But particularly, we're thinking about identity formation at a collective level. And I refer here to the idea of Benedict Anderson. I'm sure you're familiar with it. The idea of imagined communities, the idea that through these stories, we create a sense of community. A sense of community even with people that we don't have never met in person. Obviously, when it comes to families and cities, we're sometimes talking about embodied communities, communities face to face. When we talk about larger units, such as the nation, which is the subject of Benedict Anderson's book, our Europe or the world planet, we're talking very much about imagined communities. The point made by Halbwachs in the 1920s was that whenever we produce a story about the past, we do so within a social framework. And those social frameworks, as we are now discovering within memory studies, are very multiple. We have the families, the cities, as I mentioned, and historically, the nation has, of course, has been extremely important. But the nation, of course, is now, as it were, under pressure, or rather we have to see it as coexisting with smaller units such as the city and bigger units such as the Europe and the world. And even at a farther reach, we could talk about the planet, and some of my colleagues do so. The point here is that we have these multiple different frameworks for thinking about memory. An important thing that needs to be recalled here is that part of this production, it's not just an accumulation of stories, an accumulation of identities. There's constantly a struggle going on in the creation of identities between remembering and forgetting, and then what I call unforgetting, the undoing a process of forgetting. Some of you may be familiar with Ernest Renan's famous article, What is a Nation?, where he says the essence of a nation is that its members have many things in common, but also that they have forgotten many things. Every French citizen has to have forgotten the Saint Bartholomew massacre, which he meant, in other words, if we're going to live together and piece together and imagine ourselves as part of the same community, we also have to be prepared to forget certain things, forget the things that divide us. Now, as we know, this process of forgetting is an extremely complex one, because it can also be about erasing important past. It can be about continuing on acts of historical injustice by marginalizing certain groups and not allowing their story to be brought into circulation and into the public space, which means that we're talking about here about a dynamic system of this process of remembering and forgetting and unforgetting, which has a certain power aspect to it, because we're talking about the question of which group gets to impose its story on the public space and allow it to become dominant, and what are the possibilities for minority groups to offer challenges to the dominant narratives from a position, as it were, outside the system. So what we're seeing here is this constant dynamic of forgetting, remembering, which of course is linked to the production of stories across all these media, which is linked in turn to this system of checks and balances of domination and contestation. So that's, in a nutshell and very fast, some of the basic principles of cultural memory studies. Now, what I want to focus on now for the rest of this talk is the question of monuments. What particular role does monuments play in this dynamic? The question of monuments was not, for a long time, was sort of ignored within cultural memory studies. The idea was, okay, they're the sort of the end point of recognition and not very interesting. However, there's been quite a change of that in recent times. It's become, you could call it a hot topic in cultural memory studies. And that has everything to do, in the first instance, with questions of current events. As you may have followed, current events, I mean, in Western Europe and in the United States, where we have a whole challenging being made to the commemoration of figures who stand for white supremacist values or who stand for colonialism. And here you see this wonderful image of the statue of Colston, a slave owner who was dumped into the harbour in Bristol in June 2020. So we have a lot going on at the moment, which makes it very important, I think, to talk about monuments. And of course, this is a belated, as it were, version of the discussion, which I'm sure took place all across Eastern Europe, which I know took place across Eastern Europe, though I don't know the details of it in all cases, about what to do with monuments after the end of communism. So this is sort of catch up, as it were, and I think there's interesting points of discussion between questions of post-colonialism and post-communism, which hopefully we could have a chance to engage in. But there's also another more theoretical development, which I think has made monuments particularly interesting, and that's what I call new materialism in cultural studies. And this is a huge area of research, and I'm going to not go into it, but simply flag the point that, if you like, for a long time in cultural studies, we looked at meanings. We looked at meanings, as it were, in a disembodied way. We looked at ideas. What new materialism, and there's many different philosophers one could mention here. I mentioned particularly Jane Bennett and Bruno Latour. What they have made us aware of is the fact that meanings are produced as a combination of mind and matter, if you like. That matter, and whether that's matter in the form of statues or matter in the forms of technologies, that they have power as well, that they are part of the picture, and that, if you like, the culture is co-produced by minds and matters. And if we think about monuments, then we could say, okay, we have a physical object, that's the matter, but it has meaning, but it also has power. It has normative power. And I think this is captured in the German terms of Mahnmal and Denkmal. These are objects which have the power to exhort us to think of the past or to warn us to do certain things. So what I'm interested in thinking about is how we can bring into our discussion of monuments this idea of monuments having agency. Now, so far in the discussion of monuments and memory studies, the emphasis has very much been on the post-1945 tradition, the tradition of what you like, of a new type of non-celebratory monuments which are about mourning, monuments which are about reflection. And I'm referring here particularly to Robert E. Young's book on the stages of memory. He's written several books on the topic. And he's been extremely important in bringing out the complexities of these types of modern post-Holocaust memorials, in which the emphasis is on interaction, the individual subject who is interacting with particular forms of matter. I just give one example here, the Stolpersteine, the stumbling stones, which have been put up around Europe in front of houses of which had been occupied before the Second World War by Jews. And these are literally small objects which are designed to make us stumble, not physically, but morally, in the sense that you have to stop and look and think and reflect. So this is a wonderful example of this type of interaction between material meaning and also, as it were, the operation of space and the powers exerted in space. Robert Young's emphasis seems to imply that this type of interaction is very typical of the post-war, post-Second World War monuments. I think he ignores a lot of the history of monumentalization, which I've myself have studied quite a bit, particularly in relation to the 19th century, where we have these sort of monumental, what we now call old-fashioned monuments of the wrong type, if you like, but nevertheless very interesting in their own right. And the obvious point to be made about them, of course, is they're very big, they're monumental. And their very bigness, their very size is designed to, as it were, impose themselves on the city space. They are designed to generate awe, respect. They're also designed in many ways to make us move around them. So that, if you like, the city life is organized around these monuments. They're often placed in the very center of a city, forcing traffic and people to move around them, exercising their force, moving into, as it were, the very fabric of everyday life. More than has hitherto been recognized, these monuments are also have an interactive component. And I'm looking here particularly at the Lion Monument to Waterloo, which is this extraordinarily huge monument put up by the Dutch king in 1826, which is designed to allow the viewer to climb up onto a position of dominance, a sort of a panoptic vision of the battlefield, and therefore, as it were, to occupy as an individual the position of the winner. The same applies to the Nelson's Pillar in Dublin, which was put up to remember Trafalgar Square, and which also is a tourist attraction, was designed to be a tourist attraction, so that you could climb to the top and, as it were, see the city of Dublin from this position of the central power of the, if you like, the colonial power. Not for nothing was this pillar blown up by the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, in 1966, which brings me to the next point is the fact that since these monuments exercise such power in the city space, they've also been the focus of what I call mnemonic regime change. When regimes have changed, we see it going together with getting rid of these monuments. As it were, the shift of political regime is reflected in the possibility of now finally being able to destroy monuments. And I give you various examples here, which we could come back to perhaps later. The most interesting for me example, the one I've studied most of the destruction of a monument relating to regime change, is the destruction of the Vendôme column in Paris in 1871, which was, as you see, a hugely spectacular event, one which demanded incredible organization. So it was a reflection of the power of the new commune to organize itself, that it was capable of, and to show it was capable of such a massive organization. Widely displayed around Europe. So part of this mnemonic change of destroying a monument is also linked to this spectacular moment of reenacting a performing regime change. What I find interesting in the legitimation of this act on the part of the Commune de Paris in the 12th of April 1871, because this was done by decree, is that it reflects the fact of that monuments were actually found to have a very negative power, right? They have a power, and they were perceived as, and I've highlighted here, an affirmation of militarism, a negation of international law, a permanent insult to the vanquished on the part of the conquerors, a perpetual attack on one of the three great principles of the French Republic, fraternity. And so for all of these reasons, the commune decreed that the Vendôme column will be demolished. And I think these are really interesting to think about as a permanent insult to the vanquished on the part of conquerors. To realize that the physical presence of these monuments can actually have an impact, an emotional impact, and a moral impact on those who are forced to tolerate their presence. And I think we need to bear this in mind when we talk about the fate of monuments in our own time. Okay, so what the commune did is they destroyed the monument, and then many of the communards got themselves photographed in front of the destruction, destroyed statues, in order, as it were, to start creating a new memory, a memory which had a new starting point, which was the starting point of 1871, in which they themselves, the communards, instead of Napoleon, to whom the column had been dedicated, would then shape the future memory. So these are part of the dynamics which I think are extremely important to look at. Moving ahead, we can also think about, of course, that demolishing, actually physically breaking down a monument is not the only way to affect mnemonic regime change. There's all sorts of different techniques which have been used and which are now being developed, and I'll just flag some of them, which are about you leave the monument in place, but you give it a different meaning. And obviously, if you write Black Lives Matter across a monument to the American Confederacy, you have clearly, as it were, overlaid one story with another story. The same thing happens with the Coldstone monument, which I showed earlier, being thrown into the harbor. It has been replaced, or was replaced in a sort of a guerrilla art by a statue of a Black Lives Matter activist. And here we have this wonderful example too from Budapest of the monument to the Soviet Army having been reworked in 2011 in this sort of pop art form, which I think is also a comment on Americanization as much as it's a statement about a change of or marking a discontinuity with the communist era. So these are many of these examples of sort of re-signifying are linked to ephemeral guerrilla forms of what you might call creative vandalization, which help to, as it were, mark in the public space the change of meaning. Another technique, which again you're very familiar with, I believe it's been very important in Estonia with the bronze soldier monument, is about reframing the monument. You leave the monument intact, but you put it into a different place. This is an example, though it's not, it's taken from Budapest, where the remains, here the monument is no longer intact, the monument to Stalin, which was destroyed in 1956, the remainders of it have now been relocated in the Memento Park in Budapest. And the importance of this relocation is that the monument, it's the same monument in many cases, not in this one, in many cases, same monument, but it gets a different meaning because it is it becomes a display object. And here I draw on Barbara Kirchenbach-Grimblitz's idea of display objects, so that it loses its power. It loses its power to dominate the public space and dominate the public conversation, and becomes, as it were, a piece of heritage, as a display object, a piece of the past rather than the present. As a last example of decommissioning, we had this idea, well, what do you put in the place of a monument that, you know, there's a space, a gap in the public space, doesn't have to be filled, but there seems to be a logic in this dynamic that new voices, new stories who want to be heard also want to inscribe themselves into the public space. Here we find, I think, an interesting example of an alternative monument, which was made by Cara Walker last year. And it's actually a pastiche of a 1911 monument to Victoria, and which was put up in the Tate Modern Gallery. So it looks from a distance as if it's just a typical monumental monument, but when you get up close to it, it's actually it's a monument depicting slavery. So here we have the theme of slavery being brought into the public arena, in the first instance into a museum, but through a sort of, as it were, a creative appropriation of the language of colonial monumentalism, in this case to make a statement about the need to recognize the history of slavery. So let me just try and see if I can wrap up. And I think I've tried to show here how this sort of how we're dealing with a dynamic system, and in which monuments as objects play a role, and which have a meaning but can acquire a new meaning as the world around them changes and as they are reinscribed in different ways by different voices. So if I just might leave you a couple of things to think about by way of conclusion. I think a lot of the discussion about the monuments has been about their meanings. I think we have to think about them also in terms of the emotions they can induce, and that these emotions and people's attitudes are very important to how we understand how they function in public space. But how they function in public space, if they have power, it's partly to do with their physical size, but it's above all to do with the stories in other media. So if a colonial statue takes on a new meaning, it's because of the stories in other media. So we have to look at these processes in an integrated way. What makes monuments so incredibly fascinating, I think, is that they offer a public space for mnemonic contention. Instead of having just memory in our minds, as it were, they make memory visible. They make memory tangible. They provide a place where people can come together. And in that way, the question of the past enters into the present itself as people assemble around these monuments in order to contest them. And finally, I think it's interesting for us all to think about this sort of tension between materialities and their fixity, right? In the sense of how monuments and buildings and city spaces have a certain continuity across time, and how this relates to memory in its contentiousness. And I mean by this memory as this constant site of contestation about who we are and who belongs to us and whose story deserves to be told in the public space. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very clear and informative talk, and bringing in also the examples from this year already, the very recent ones. And now we have about 10 minutes for questions and answers session. So any questions right away?
Hello, and thank you very much for this talk. I've also found this perspectives of studying culture memory and combining it with this interest towards new materialism very fascinating. However, when I've discussed this with my students, and I also feel that it's quite a challenge for them, how to really come to this agency of material objects in the functioning of collective memory, for example. I think like with monuments, it's in many ways easier to show their agency. But then I was wondering, could you give some other examples and perhaps also say briefly that when one is interested in the agency of material objects in the shaping of collective memory, then how to study or how to start this kind of a study really? To which aspects should we pay attention to and so on? Thanks.
Thank you very much for this question. It's a very important one, and of course, I made it very easy for myself, taking monuments as the point of departure for this discussion, because I think it's most obvious in the case of monuments. So I'm suitably challenged by your question about what other cases can I think of, and I agree absolutely. It's difficult. But I think if we're thinking, but I think it's not impossible when you think of public spaces, for example, and I might take an example from my own experience, two examples from my own experience. One is the question of having grown up in Dublin in the 1960s, when there was a sense in which a lot of the architecture of the city was not part of the national tradition. There was a sense that it was a colonial architecture, and therefore it should be demolished. And in many cases, sadly, in retrospect, things were demolished. So I think there is, in discussions about what sort of buildings to be kept and what sort of places to be cherished, I think that we have this sense of that we have the beginnings of a similar sort of discussion. And we see in this sort of associations that people have with places and their commitment to places, their love of certain places, or their distaste for certain places, that these are come into the discussion in a way which it cannot just be resolved by simply saying it's part of our heritage or not. The other example that I have, and it's a more subtle one, comes from my present location, and that is in the Netherlands, where we have the very good fortune, for example, in our university to have some very beautiful old buildings. And so these are not monuments, if you like, to colonialism, but if you think harder about the nature of the buildings, the fact that we can enjoy such lovely spaces has a connection to the history of the Netherlands as a colonial power, and which gave it so much wealth, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. So I think there's sort of discussions that one can have on the basis of the places, the rooms in which one is in, the furnishings of the rooms, the nature of the spaces around, to see how what ways they are, as it were, allowing us to assume certain positions. And I think in terms of enjoying beautiful buildings, that enjoyment itself is something that we could use as a starting point for thinking about the power of those spaces in our thinking, or thinking about what we assume as being normal and what we should reflect on as being perhaps something which is linked to a history. These are just some examples of, I think, the directions one might go in, but it's obviously something that we have to think about more for the future. Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Well, okay, then can't quite make out where the camera is, so that you could see it. But I actually wanted to come to the buildings as well, and I'm glad that you actually partly answered my question already. That how it's not just monuments, but it can be also built spaces, not just public space, but also dwellings or also landscape that can get a meaning and have the same type of problems and also solutions to them. But my other question would be that re-signifying the monuments, which has been sort of guerrilla art way or doing it right now, how efficient do you think it is, or does it really change their meaning, or for whom and for how long? Would you like to say something about it?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very important question, for whom and for how long. I think if we think of, like, if I come back to my last point, which is about the sort of fixity of objects and monuments and the sort of the contentiousness of memory, I think we have to think about I think we have to realize we're never going to get a long-term solution, nor should we, right? Part of this, the tradition of monumentalism is to say it's for eternity, right? We put down this monument and it will mean the same thing forever and a day. Clearly, there's no eternity in human life, and monuments take on a new meaning. And I think we have to also bring this into the discussion, that these sort of guerrilla performances are very important in the here and now, in what's happening in the present. And they don't offer a permanent solution. But as I said, I don't think there is a permanent solution. Having said that, then we have a new type of challenge when I think about any future sort of memorializations or monuments. I think we would now, knowing the history of monuments that we now know, we would be very foolish to sort of say we're going to put up monuments which are forever. So we're within this sort of dilemma between sort of wanting to put up monuments which are a little bit more than just guerrilla art, at the same time not wanting to claim that we have a solution for the complete future. One of the solutions that Robert Young has examined is the idea of a counter memorial, something which has a sort of a monument with a built-in obsolescence, the idea that over a period of 50 years or so, it will gradually disappear. So there you've solved your problem at hand, and then I guess after 50 years you put up another monument. This is one possibility. But I think right now we have almost an imminent crisis about the idea of monumentalization itself, or not just monumentalization, but even memorialization. How long do we expect a monument to last, both in terms of its physical being, but also in terms of the community around it which supports it? So I think we're right in the middle of this really interesting discussion, which varies, and it involves this recognition that the ephemeral might also be an extremely important thing within this whole picture.
Thank you. Any further questions from the audience? No, the audience seems to be very quiet. Team? Okay. So if not, then once again, many thanks for this, I think, very inspiring talk, and we have a lot to think about and go further, especially from your last points on the last slide, so to take home and think about and also have further discussions. But then with that, we thank you, and we'll continue then with the next presentations already in Estonian. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.